Chapter 8. Full of activity and some unexpected incidents, our 2 weeks in England sped by. For a start, each met and was assessed by the other's mother. Jane's mother, Molly to her friends, asked me to call her Ma. She was a tall, good-looking lady with a careful social manner and bodily posture. Being a widow, the task of organising the wedding was obviously a considerable strain for her, and she relied on her close circle of friends to help her. We drove down to the south coast to see my grandmother and show her Jane's signet ring. Grandma had given each of us, her grandchildren, a gold sovereign. My sovereign had been turned into a signet ring for Jane, with Ian inscribed inside it, so I would always be in touch with her. We bought the wedding ring. I met Leo, who was to be my best man, and his wife at their Surrey home. From there, Leo and I went into London to Mosbros to hire a morning suit for me. Leo possessed his own. Jeremy, Jane's elder brother, who had done his national service as a naval training officer at Portsmouth, was due to give the bride away. He and his wife Janet arrived on the Thursday. "Thought you might need some moral support, old man." I had never thought carefully of what I might be taking on. I was marrying the only daughter of a widow. Over the 16 years since her husband was killed, she and her daughter had developed an intensely close relationship. This was revealed by the way each hung on and then giggled at the other's words. We went to the Westbourne church for a marriage service rehearsal. The vicar discovered that we had only recently arrived in England and pronounced that, regrettably, we obviously did not have the necessary 3 weeks' English residence. Therefore, he could not marry us. We managed to get an early appointment with a canon of Chichester Cathedral. He listened to the story of our plight with no obvious interest or sympathy and showed us the door. I talked of appealing to the Archbishop of Canterbury, where I thought my connections might carry some weight. After all, as I understood it, I was on the foundation of the cathedral twice over, once for having been a chorister of the cathedral, and secondly for having been a school monitor at King's. I had been told that the main cathedral bell, Bell Harry, would toll for me when I died. Ma was of sterner stuff. She was outraged and she was going to take action. Living on her own had taught her to cope with crisis. She was matriarch of her family of 3 children and 1 grandchild so far. She was a powerful figure in the village, a Westbourne ward representative on the Chichester Rural Council, and furthermore, she was a magistrate. She telephoned the vicar and their conversation went something like this. "Now listen to me, Mr. Wharton. It is now Tuesday, and my daughter is due to be married on Saturday. The banns have been read properly in your church. The children have had due notice of their marriage published in Thompson Falls, Kenya, as required there. The invitations were sent out weeks ago to over 120 guests. My prospective son-in-law was able to get 2 weeks' leave, and they have flown here 4,000 miles to be married. I have been doing some research into ecclesiastical law, and I find that the final arbiter in the matter is yourself. You are the person who decides finally on the validity of the marriage arrangements. So I cannot see what objection you can reasonably have. Will you please marry my daughter?" The Reverend Wharton agreed. Actually, he was rather a nice man. He had spent some time as a clergyman in Tanganyika, so Jane and I felt we did have some extra rapport with him. A big marquee, beautifully decorated with apple blossom from the garden, went up on the lawn at Lumley Croft, Jane's family home. Lumley Croft was a largish, pebble-dash walled house with wisteria up the whole of the side facing the garden. Our wedding day, the 10th of May, a year to the day since Jane and I first met, was fine and sunny. Martin Carnes, an old school friend from my Canterbury school days, played the organ. Bernard Tremaine, brother of the VW agent in T Falls, took cine camera shots outside the church. The house was walking distance from the church. The wedding and reception swept along. Jane was not late. I made the usual silly speech of a bridegroom. Leo did a lot better as best man. Dr. Jimmy Ricketts spoke for the family. He had spent much of the war running an operating theatre for Yugoslav partisans on an Adriatic island. He referred to the heroism and ultimate sacrifices of Jane's father, and also her uncle Terence, who had been killed as a regular officer in the Royal Marines. A clergyman who I did not recognise approached me and introduced himself as my godfather. He said he had offered up prayers for me daily over the years since we had last met, when I was a child. "Good, thank you, I needed them," I replied. A large relation of Jane's, a big wheel in BAT, engaged me in conversation. I heard later that he had pronounced himself satisfied with my replies. I turned with some relief to Uncle Arthur. Uncle Arthur claimed to be a descendant of Wellington, and he certainly looked like it. "It seems as though you may be the stronger character, Ian, so you must be kind and considerate. You certainly seem to have a charming wife." "Like yours, Uncle Arthur." "What, Phyllis? She's your godmother, isn't she?" "Oh yes, she's all right." As I approached Dr. Ricketts, I heard him say, "The trouble with Molly is that she has absolutely no imagination." What was he talking about? How Ma could not understand that Jane had chosen me? "Ian, I do want you to know that I'm sure you will look after Jane beautifully," Ma said later. The hire car we'd been using had behaved badly. Out of Westbourne we drove to the first main road. I applied the brakes. Nothing happened. Somehow, this Saturday evening, we careered across the busy dual carriageway without a scratch. The brake fluid had leaked out, and there was no chance of getting the trouble dealt with that weekend. Using gears and handbrake, we crept down to Bournemouth for our first night as man and wife. The next morning we went on to the Palace Hotel in Torquay, which I had booked as a surprise for Jane from Ma's AA book. There the car was repaired. Our honeymoon was not a great success. The hotel was large, out of season, virtually empty. The service was impersonal and the whole atmosphere cheerless. Glumly we walked the cliffs during the day. At dinner I tried to cheer up my new wife. "This is the most wonderful experience of my life," I declared. "I would much have preferred a small cosy hotel in the country," was the reply. I sulked. After all, it was a 5-star hotel out of the AA book. What more could a man do? "You should have given it more thought," said Jane. Then it was all over, and we flew back to Kenya. Our wedding presents followed by sea. Loads of sheets, pillowcases, towels, broken glass, and a canteen of cutlery from Ma. Jane would have her 25th birthday 2 months later in July. My 29th birthday was due in August. In later years I was to wonder how on earth we had the nerve to settle in Ol Jorro Orok. I had no qualifications other than matriculation. I had failed my higher certification twice because I was unable to pass the necessary subjects at the same time at the right level, and had declined a choral scholarship to Caius and Gonville College at Cambridge because they wanted me to read music while I wanted to read languages. On leaving school, I had spent 4 years trying and failing to get into farming in the UK. Then, in Kenya, my time in the veterinary department had been totally disrupted by the Mau Mau. My years as a farm manager had ended in me getting the sack. Now I had been a salesman for 18 months. I had entered into an agreement to part each year with 2/3 of my pay to buy a farm that was small by local standards and might prove to be insufficient to produce the profits which would enable me to leave my job and farm full-time. Still, my year at Dundori had taught me a great deal about growing pyrethrum. I was confident I could do that well and make the money that would more than cover the cost of buying the farm. KR, Belladina and Rex had looked after the house loyally and well in our absence. Security was always a problem. We were delighted when the Clauses gave Sandra, the little Scottie, to Jane as a wedding present. She was a black bundle of energy and fury when a stranger came near the house. I felt better about having to leave Jane every day when I drove out to work. She had the Mauser, the shotgun, the 2 dogs and KR and Belladina. We began to see, however, that the house itself was a security risk. The front door was no more than 2 wooden glass-panelled shutters, behind which a corridor led straight through to the back door. Anyone could break through either front or back door and be in the main bedroom or the sitting room in a moment. Still, it was home and we loved it. Immediately, Jane started planning the layout of the front garden. We went to a local auction and bought 2 old armchairs and 2 dressing tables to celebrate our homecoming. We now had 5 pieces of furniture. There was no proper safe for the firearms, so when I was out, Jane had to remember to take them with her to the lavatory on the outside veranda, the bath, and in fact everywhere she went in and around the house. There was an open fireplace in each room, and as the nights were often quite cold, we would usually have a log fire burning in the sitting room and in any bedroom we were using. Somehow, being a married couple was a different relationship from the short time we had lived together. Jane's previous view of herself as being poor was quite different from the position she now found herself in, and almost immediately she suffered what to her was the most unhappy experience. I had taken into employment on the farm a young African who had come from Carr Hartley's farm at Rumaruti. There they specialised in catching and taming animals for zoos around the world. This lad was a natural at handling animals, so in no time he found no difficulty in getting past Rex and Sandra and putting his slim arm through the bedroom window with its wire mesh and stealing Jane's jewellery from her dressing table. Jane was devastated. The jewellery was not particularly valuable, but the sentimental value was beyond price. The insurance company paid up. However, nothing would or could compensate Jane for those emotional ties with her home in England represented by the jewellery. The police found a watch and traced it back to the boy. Jane was called to witness in the ensuing court case. Asked her name, she said it was Jane Atkinson. Well, I don't blame you, I thought. I bought an Alsatian bitch puppy in the hope that, as well as console Jane a little, Rex might be deflected from his desperate attempts to serve Sandra when she came on heat. We named her Janet, and she and Jane became inseparable. The influence of Jane's nursing was soon apparent. She went round with an action checklist in her hand, and I found myself spending significantly more on disinfectants and antiseptics. I was no longer allowed to eat off or drink out of anything with the slightest crack, chip or defect on or in it. It's unhygienic, I was informed. Oh well, I suppose she's right, I thought. During my time at Dundori, I'd had to rush an African farm woman who'd gone into labour down to Nakuru. Similarly, Jane and I had to drive the wife of one of our farm labourers into tea falls. Another day, being without a car during the day, Jane had to stitch up a farm woman who had gashed herself quite badly. We had no anaesthetic, of course, but the woman didn't grumble. From birth, death, pain and disease were with the African. They seemed to have a different pain threshold compared to us more cosseted Europeans. At weekends, we would play tennis at tea falls and occasionally Rumaruti or Nakuru. I continued to play hockey at NAC and to be involved in amateur dramatics. Jane began to find her life more lonely than she had expected. We went to a fancy dress dance at Tea Falls. Jane designed and made 2 head masks with wire and cloth, and we won first prize as the Lady and the Tramp. Jane surprised me further with her practical abilities by efficiently nailing together a sizable chicken house. We started to keep chicken. It was true that Jane had agreed that I would try to get into the next Olympics in the Kenya hockey squad. However, I was selfish in my wish to live much as I had before our marriage. Jane decided she would need an early child to fulfill herself and to hold our marriage together. By November, she knew she was pregnant. At that time, my ties with the UK were further loosened by the news that my brother, Richard, had emigrated to the USA. Uncle Tom, a US citizen, had vouched for him, and he had joined the USAF as a guided missiles instructor, having learned all about them on his national service with the Royal Artillery. My work continued to go well. Cooper, McDoodle and Robinson East Africa Limited consisted of headquarters, Bob Hammond, managing director, Bill Floyd, accountant, Hugh Wallace, technical advisor, sales manager, seemed to change frequently, 3 married women secretaries, and field, 8 sales representatives included Malcolm Witt, Warwick Waddy Fear, Brandon Danzy, and a girl, Elspeth McClellan, who was probably the best sales rep of us all. The business was concentrated heavily on the European farmers in Kenya, with very little in Tanganyika and virtually none in Uganda. Kenya farmers were being encouraged to develop their sheep industry. A United Nations sheep expert, Dr. Harry Carroll, a veterinarian originating from Australia, arrived. An excellent speaker who had written a veterinary book 2 inches thick, full of enthusiasm, he was at the same time extremely practical. His previous work for the UN had been in Chile and Spain. I decided to build on the new interest in sheep and, with the ready agreement of the manager there, arranged to hold a Cooper Sheep Day at the Government Agricultural Station on the Tea Falls Road from Ol Jorro Orok. The manager and his staff put in a lot of work to get the farm ready. The weather was cool and wet, but nothing could dampen the enthusiasm on the day. There was a large turnout of farmers, and John Gillette, a knowledgeable Scottish sheep farmer from the bottom of the Owl Caloo Valley, was the main speaker. I laced the hot tea refreshments with whiskey, and the farmers swayed away at the end of the afternoon, rating the experience most interesting and useful. Mr. Hammond was delighted to get the news of the success. As a show of the company's thanks, he offered to give the station manager, who was soon to be married, a wedding present. Let him just name it. Coopers would gladly give it. The manager asked for a Persian carpet. There was a long silence from head office, following which a case of cut glass arrived with all best wishes. The managers reacted by switching the station's purchases from Cooper products to those of a new competitor. The saving my MD had made on the wedding present was lost many times over in the loss of Cooper product sales to the station over a number of years. I was not amused. I was getting to know my customers. There was Dolly, who had been a top society hostess in the UK. It was said that salesmen needed to don asbestos underpants when visiting her. It seemed to me that Sid had a smirk of self-satisfaction on his face after an unnecessary visit to her small farm. Or perhaps he was acting in an attempt to make me envious. There was Raymond Hook, a member of Mensa, whose wife and 2 attractive daughters lived in a separate house from him on their farm. Raymond Hook had Somali girlfriends and lived in some squalor in his house, drinking out of cracked cups served onto broken tables, surrounded by unstable chairs. Travel could be an adventure for everyone. 1 or 2 large ranches had aeroplanes. Everyone else relied on the dust roads and their farm vehicles to travel anywhere. The roads were graded by the Public Works Department, PWD. Their surfaces were skimmed and the ridges thus removed for a while. Even more of a hazard than potholes could be the corrugations of the road that would develop. Vehicles would threaten to judder to pieces on corrugations. I knew of people who believed that one could travel at a certain speed, which would enable one to move serenely from the top of each corrugation to the top of the next. Personally, I never did discover that miracle speed. The attributes required of a vehicle were height off the road, reliable suspension, and as few doors as possible to rattle or fall off. One day I was travelling a road with deep corrugations when the car approaching me in the opposite direction lost a wheel. The car and its European driver careered off the road into a wire fence. I gave him a lift back to his bungalow. We discussed local matters, and little or nothing was said about the accident. It was one of the accepted hazards of settler life. This sort of physical danger was added to the high disease risk, and of course security risk. I never left Jane alone at night. If my work required me to travel to the edge of my area, then I would arrange for us to stay with a farmer there. This was never any problem. People were most generous in helping us out. Jane and I were starting to develop our own small farm. KR had recruited a fellow Maragoli, Reuben, as gardener. Our farm workers were burning selected areas of grass to be pyrethrum fields. We had received our pyrethrum license and seed and erected shaded seed beds near the house. We prepared to plant out the seedlings. Everything grown seems to have its parasite. Pyrethrum was no exception. Although the extract from its flowers was about the most immediately potent killer of insects known, the plants themselves attracted parasites called thrips. These we killed by spraying with DDT solution. We started to realize what being poor really meant. We can't really afford holidays, I said to myself. We spend all the time pinching and scraping, so our holidays are sport when we have them. I'm going to make sure the day comes when I do not have to think about money when we're on holiday. I started sawing up our wild olive trees to make charcoal for sale. A young Kikuyu, Kamau, was full of enthusiasm and ideas, was appointed farm foreman. He and I loaded a hired truck with charcoal, which we took down to Ol Kalu. There we sold the charcoal off the back of the truck to Africans at the roadside. And, of course, we used charcoal at home in the clothes iron that KR wielded. KR came into the house one day, accompanied by a fairly scruffy-looking fellow tribesman. "This is my Ndugu, who has come to stay with me for a while," he exclaimed. "Okay, thanks for letting me know," I replied. The Ndugu stayed and stayed. "What work does he do for you?" I asked. "Oh, he doesn't work, but he is my Ndugu, and I have to feed and shelter him." Days and weeks went by. Eventually I lost my patience, criticizing KR for spending on his Ndugu his small amount of pay, money that should have been going to Belladina and their children. KR was deeply religious, cycling the 7 miles on the rough dusty road to Mass and Tea Falls each Sunday morning. "But it is my duty, Bwana." "Yes, but look, KR, you only have so much money, and your first duty is to Belladina, your wife." Eventually, with a show of reluctance, KR gave way and his Ndugu departed. Talking of Ndugus, Jane's Aunt Violet came to visit us. I knew that first-hand reports would soon be wending their way back to Ma. We have nothing to hide, I thought. We are poor and we are struggling. We can't work harder than the hours allow, and Violet herself is not well off in Tanganyika. In the event, it was an enjoyable visit for us all, and Violet later gave us the money to buy a new prestige pram, saying, "You cannot have a firstborn and no pram." It was a gift that was much appreciated by us, and it was used for each of our 3 children as they came along. I cut down on my hockey and spent more time on amateur dramatics, in which I both acted and directed. Then I heard that the talented headmaster and his wife at the Van Riebeek School planned to put on Gilbert and Sullivan's The Yeoman of the Guard. My first career choice before farming had always been singing. I went to the audition and was given the lead part of Colonel Fairfax. This was really a tenor part, but they prepared to transpose it down for my light baritone voice. Going through the music, I was surprised to hear such lovely choral music. I had not realized that Gilbert and Sullivan had written such music. Not only the choruses, but the dramatic aria, "'Tis done, I am a bride." For me, to sing again was like letting a genie out of a bottle, and to sing in opera had always been the height of my teenage ambitions. I had sung as a soprano for 5 years in the Canterbury Cathedral Choir. Then at King's I had become the leading baritone. On hearing me at that time, one of England's top basses had been sufficiently impressed to invite me to call on him for career advice. Aged 17, I had been offered a choral scholarship at Caius in Gonville, Cambridge, which I had declined partly because they wanted me to read music when I had preferred to read languages. Aged 18, I declined a re-offer of the Caius in Gonville scholarship and failed to win the most prestigious choral scholarship in England, King's, Cambridge. It was won that year by the son of the Archbishop of Canterbury. At that time, the renowned bass Robert Easton had heard me and said that if he were not a family friend, he would advise me to go for it and make singing my career. But he knew how much luck was involved and advised me to get another career first. At a Swiss pension in my summer holidays from school, I had sung Lieder and collected books of them, which had been stolen at Naivasha. Dad had obtained an interview for me at the Guildhall School of Music. To my considerable disappointment, they had forecast that my voice would settle as a light baritone. Another contact of Dad had said he thought he could use me as a dubbing voice on films he was making. Anyway, all this came to nothing when I turned to farming. At my first farming job, I had trained the village choir. Later, I had been about to join the Rochester Cathedral Choir when I left for Kenya. In Salisbury, Rhodesia, I had sung with the Choral Society, and in Nairobi with the Cathedral Choir. Now the intense emotions stirred up by singing were with me again. My excuses to myself for getting involved were that I would become even more intimately wrapped up in the local community. This would be good for our social lives and for business. Indeed, the sales in my territory soared. Mr. Hammond was delighted and commented to others in Coopers that this was the way to be a Cooper representative. My customers would no longer see me as a commercial parasite. However, amateur dramatics are time-consuming, requiring long evening rehearsals, and this operatic production brought other problems. The part of Jack Point was to be played by a master at the school who had been a professional actor in South Africa. He was the show's director. My leading lady was a teacher's wife, Jeanette, an excellent soprano whose sister was a professional opera singer in Italy. "Ian, your scenes with Jeanette are too wooden. There is no believable romance to be felt in them. You two will have to get together and develop some romantic feelings towards one another. No, I'm serious. You are amateurs, and you don't have time to develop your acting techniques." The Afrikaans accents in the school chorus amused some of the UK settlers, but we thought it was a good show and we took it on tour to Nakuru and Eldoret. However, it brought discord to my relationship with Jane, as she grew heavy with our first child. She would sit in tears. I would be quietly defiant. Her male admirers would continue to admire with greater hope. A signal of Jane's pregnancy was an untypical craving she developed for stuffed olives. Around this craving she knitted sweaters, cardigans and gloves for me, and she was careful with her small housekeeping allowance. More than once I was relieved to find that she had saved some shillings that we were able to use for some farm expense. Jane received a Christmas card from Bill. This she displayed prominently on the mantelpiece. Eventually I objected and no more arrived. How he obtained our address and how he was contacted to persuade him to desist was a mystery to me. At this time, another mystery was the case of the opera audio tape. The yeoman of the guard was taped, and each member of the cast received a copy. After a short time, mine disappeared. Jane said she had no idea what could have happened to it. At regular intervals, missives arrived from Ma. Usually these contained letters she had received from Jeremy and Janet, which tended to detail their first child's precocious performances at reading and at school. At school, Jane had found difficulty in learning foreign languages. Swahili was no exception for her. KR was having difficulty in coping with his new Memsab's demands, without the problem of understanding her Swahili. One day I returned from work to be met by a highly frustrated KR, who had been having some angry exchanges with Jane. "Shurigani, KR?" I asked. "Huyu nasema," he started, which means really not madam or Memsab says, but this woman says. He went on to explain the problem and I managed to calm him down. Over the years we were to develop a close, mutually trusting relationship with him. While staying with Torben on his farm, we drove out to Buffalo Springs, a magical place in the NFD. These were natural, cool springs in what was virtually desert country. The usual desert pack animal, of course, is the camel, and there were plenty of these to be seen around Buffalo Springs. It was now March 1959, and we were waiting for the rains to start. Monkeys from our forest had been raiding the vegetable patches and I had to shoot one. The pyrethrum seedlings were waiting to be planted out. The clouds covered us each day, but very little rain dropped. Eventually it came, later than expected, and there was great excitement as we planted out our first fields. Paying for the farm by instalments, as well as the house and garden servants, the farm labour, not to mention the pyrethrum seeds, was making life difficult financially. Fortunately, there was a new young manager at Barclays Bank in Tea Falls. His policy was to be quite liberal with overdrafts, so we had sufficient borrowed working capital. Food was another cost. Occasionally we bought meat from the small African butcher near the bottom of our farm at half the price we would have paid Andrew Dykes, the European butcher in Tea Falls, father of John Dykes, who I had worked with at GHQ Intelligence. Jane's main staple diet was potato soup and some vegetables that Reuben had been able to grow, those that the monkeys had not pinched. "How can we expect to have a healthy child from a diet of potato soup?" Jane asked. I was conscience-smitten. If I could get a house cow, we could tether her near the house to supplement Jane's rations. Her only milk had been skimmed milk dropped in by Colonel Corbett from time to time. Dairy farmers skimmed their milk, sending away the cream to the cooperative creameries depot for butter and cheese making. Secretly, I went to a local cattle auction, where I was delighted to find an in-milk Jersey cross. The cow was delivered to Jane with great ceremony, and she started to have full cream milk in her diet. A week later, the cow appeared listless. I called in Roger Brown, the vet, who pronounced that it was a tick-borne disease which had been in the cow when I bought her. 3 days later, she died. As Jane became more pregnant, she found our narrow bed with its dip in the middle so uncomfortable she started to sleep on the floor with the dogs. Jane's artistic leanings, she claimed Joshua Reynolds was in her family tree, started to show in the garden at the front of the house, where Reuben's clearance efforts were supplemented by her flower seed sowings. There was a large potato creeper over the back of the house, and a rose rambled over my small outside office set against the side of the house. The telephone was a party line that also supplied several neighbours. Each of us was identified by a different Morse code ring, dots and dashes, so it was not uncommon that one could not use it because one's neighbour was already on the line. One would discover this only by picking up the receiver and hearing a voice already speaking. Besides Colonel Corbett, our neighbours included Brigadier Thorpe, Major Smallwood and Major General Smallwood, his father, farming next door to him. We were surrounded by the military. I had heard the lovely story about Sheila Pearson's father. He had bought a farm next to a senior naval officer who had a large sign up outside his farm track entrance with the farm name Admiral's End on it. It was not long before the Admiral found to his extreme annoyance that the new settler had named his farm with a large sign, Snotty's Bottom. There was a glorious view from our house looking towards the Aberdare Mountains. Up the Aberdare Road from Tea Falls there were European farms in considerable isolation. To make some money and at the same time to get closer to the farming community, I started looking for opportunities to arrange imports of pedigree breeding stock from my old employer in Kent. On the South Kinangop, I found a dairy farmer for whom I arranged import of a pedigree Ayrshire bull calf. Later, I sold imports of Romney Marsh rams to Jim Tooley, who was now also farming on South Kinangop. The charcoal business was going quite well, although the local market was limited. I started looking at other possibilities from the 80 acres of forest. There were large cedar trees in the forest, and I approached Kasuku, who expressed an interest in cutting them down and selling the timber for building work. The first planting of pyrethrum was over. Now I had to invest in a pyrethrum dryer. The pyrethrum's insecticide extracted from pyrethrum was very potent and yet remarkably safe to humans. In its potentiated form, it was the main ingredient in the Cooper fly killer aerosol that was soon to become the brand leader in the UK. A problem with pyrethrum was that from the moment the flower heads were picked, the pyrethrin's potency in them started to drop. To curb this drop in potency, the flowers needed to be dried. Drying in the sun was possible. However, it was at best a slow process, requiring continual turning of the flowers in continuous sun. So, farmers used pyrethrum dryers, in which they artificially dried the flowers. The smallest dryer in the market resembled a mammoth wardrobe. Inside, at the base, charcoal could smoulder underneath trays of flowers, the fumes exiting through ducts in the roof. I counted our shillings and bought one. We were fortunate in having an excellent GP, Dr. Lowy, who lived just outside Tea Falls. A Czechoslovakian Jew without the necessary qualifications to practice in the UK, he was renowned among all races in the local community as a committed, resourceful doctor. As Jane's pregnancy progressed, he proclaimed to us that she gave every indication that she would be an excellent milking cow. Jane would have to go down to Nakuru Hospital for the end of May birth. The farm was too unhygienic, and there were no midwives around. Nor was there any national health service. Giving birth was not covered by our company medical insurance. This was going to cost, and where would Jane stay prior to the birth? Fortunately, Bombay's ranch was just outside Nakuru on the Nairobi Road. He and his wife Maureen happily agreed that Jane could stay there. It was 35 miles through Dundori down to the ranch, and as the day drew near, I took Jane down to Bombay's house and left her. Nakuru was not part of my sales territory, so I would have to be travelling many miles away visiting my customers. However, the RASK, the Royal Agricultural Society of Kenya, Nakuru show was to be held at the beginning of June, and I would be needed to help in planning and manning the Cooper stand. So this gave me the excuse to visit Jane regularly and occasionally to stay the night. You know, Ozzy, I don't know of anyone who's made a lot of dough out of pyrethrum. It was Bombay talking. I've seen people make a lot of money down here in the Rift Valley, but not on those small farms up your way. Well, I'm sure Terry made plenty up at Bryn Glass. Well, maybe, but you're not a member of the Pyrethrum Marketing Board as Terry is. You can't fiddle your pyrethrum license. I was thinking I might go into sheep or something. Well, I don't know anything about sheep. It's always been cattle here, But I think you should think carefully about it all, Ozzy. Perhaps you should leave farming and concentrate on being a commercial parasite. After all, the way politics are going here, anything can happen. Why, don't you see yourself staying here forever, Bombay? This is your family farm. Yes, Ozzy, but you know, we have to think carefully about our future. Come out in the Land Rover for an hour. I've got some Sahiwal crosses to show you. We'll take my Kip Foreman with us. Do you remember him? He used to do some tracking for us in the regiment. Shot a Mickey straight out the tree one day, before anyone else had ever dreamed there were Mickeys around. As we wound our way back toward Bombay's house, I returned to the subject of politics. Jane and I have joined the Capricorn African Society. In fact, I'm the local secretary. What do you think, Bombay? We can keep control of Kenya through a multiple vote system until the African gets educated enough to take over the country, and we go to a one-man, one-vote system. Oh, you're spitting against the wind, Ozzy. You'll never control things. The Africans will never wait. They'll see that as our excuse to delay their uhuru. So what do we do? Sit tight and hope and make as much money as possible while the going's good, Ozzy. Jane and I joined the worried settlers in church. What was to be our future? Should we continue to believe that this was our destiny? Increasingly, we distrusted the utterances from the UK and the BBC, and even some of our own Kenya European politicians. Looking around the congregation, we saw decent Christian families. For many, everything they owned was in their farms. What could they expect to get for their farms if they sold them? The Lord will protect you, asserted our vicar from his pulpit. Well, perhaps Jane will change my luck, I mused. Our child was 2 weeks overdue, so the hospital doctor decided that an induction was preferable to just waiting. Jane went into hospital for the relevant drip to be installed. Result? Nothing. They decided to break her waters to bring on the birth. Result? Nothing. Jane was getting desperate. There was no way she was going to stay any longer in the hospital. She insisted on leaving. And despite the risk of infection from dust, she walked with me around the Nakuru show. By evening, when we returned to the hospital, there were encouraging signs that birth might be fairly imminent. Helplessly and uselessly, I stood by as Jane went through the intensely painful contractions. Eventually, the hospital sister pointed out that I was not a lot of help and suggested that I leave. On the 11th of June, our firstborn, a son, was delivered. Names for boy or girl had long been agreed. He was called Nigel because we liked the name, Benjamin because we liked the name, and Robert after my maternal grandfather.